and thanks to our Malaysian colleagues for those kind words. Minister, the abuse, the neglect, the beating, the mistreatment of tens and tens of thousands of children by church-run institutions in this country over decades, with the collusion or facilitation of the state, is a very, very dark chapter of shame in the history of our country. And thousands and thousands of people who survived those industrial schools, orphanages, other forms of residential institution where this abuse, this neglect, this incarceration took place, are elderly now, and they have been marked, most of them, indelibly with the scars of the abuse and the punishment and the neglect that the church and state inflicted on them. And they have fought long and hard for that redress. I think it was Bertie Ahern, when he was Taoiseach, who initially apologised for the abuse that these children, and that's what they were, children, tens of thousands of them, abused by church and state in this way. The state apologises. I don't know how many Taoiseach that is ago, that when Bertie Ahern was, but that's quite a long time. And here we have a bill which is supposed to be about providing supports for the survivors of that residential abuse, which the representatives of the survivors say should not proceed because it has failed them, because the government have not listened to what the survivors of this abuse said and asked for. Now that's pretty damning. And of course, they know best. I only know from, the individual accounts I hear, refreshing my memory by reading some of the documents provided by the Library and Research Service, and the comments that are being made by the representatives of the survivors in the media over the last few days. But it is surely pretty damning that the people for whom we are supposed to be providing the services and supports and redress are saying this bill is so inadequate it should not proceed, and that we should stop it until the government actually take on board what the survivors and their representatives have asked for in terms of true redress and justice for the people who suffered so horribly. And it is worth reminding ourselves, I just was preparing for this discussion, of the level of suffering that these children went through. But the facts are really, really shocking. 90% of those who went through the institutions had survived multiple forms of mistreatment, especially physical and emotional, institutional abuse and neglect. 50%, almost 50%, had suffered sexual abuse by members of the church, by employees, and then by the failure of the state to properly inspect and oversee these institutions where this abuse, sexual, emotional, physical, was endemic and systematic over decades. 4 out of 5 had psychological disorders, over double the rate in the rest of the community. The rate of psychological disorders was more than double that in international community samples. Much, much worse than anywhere else in the world. Over half reported one or more trauma-related symptom in the 6 months prior to this survey being done. Symptoms such as avoidance, 50% suffering flashbacks, 38% suffering anxiety. 3/4 had experienced one or more very significant lifelong problems, including educational disadvantage, unemployment, homelessness, self-harm, and so on. So the ramifications for the individuals rolling on for decades and into old age. And as a result, the Trust Hats report, commissioned by Karen Ewa, found an incredible concentration of disadvantage among the survivors, who were overwhelmingly working class children, the children of poorer families. Their research findings concluded that the current living conditions of survivors are highly disadvantaged when compared with the population as a whole. More than half of all survivors are living in the most disadvantaged 20% of areas, suggesting that their experience of institutional residential care in Ireland may have compounded and certainly did not alleviate any baseline risks of poverty, deprivation and social exclusion they may have inherited as a result of their social origins. And of course, you know that talking to the survivors. So we have let them down, and we've let them down badly. And according to them, only 4 of the recommendations that their consultative forum made have been taken up out of 24, including some of those that have been enumerated by previous speakers. Because if you've done that much damage, that is indelibly marked. These people who are children, but it is rolled through at every level in terms of education, their health, physical and mental, their housing, their ability to gain employment, their requirement for other supports because of the damage and trauma they suffered, and that has rolled on to their children and sometimes grandchildren. The intergenerational impact of that abuse and that neglect. And we have not listened to them. We have not listened to them in recognising that they have complex and specific, because they are human beings, and that was the whole point. So a sort of, minimalist, one-size-fits-all approach, rather than recognising the individual specific trauma that people have suffered and providing the supports necessary to give them redress from the state and the institutions that failed them. So that means listening to them in the first instance, because they were so neglected, ignored, incarcerated, brutalised and so on, listening to them and developing redress and supports that actually match their individual needs. And they give some redress for the terrible suffering and neglect they have suffered. So the question of the Health Amendment Act card, and not just this enhanced medical card, the question of housing needs, the question of income that is related, not just a miserable €3,000 payment, but that is related to their actual needs, the cost of living, and particularly as they get older, the types of individually necessary counselling supports, psychotherapy, as some people mentioned, educational access and supports in order to address the damage that has been done. So, Minister, I don't know, are you going to, at this stage, listen to the survivors? But it really would be a terrible travesty and make a mockery of these apologies that we get periodically after people who've suffered or have been neglected or ignored by the state, who get these grandiose moments of state apology. We got a huge media fanfare, but then you look at what happens after, and actually we fail people. We don't follow through on these apologies and give them the things that they need. And if I might finally mention in that regard, and I mentioned it on the day that Simon Harris was nominated and elected by this House as Taoiseach, I mentioned, and I don't know much of the details, but I mentioned it that day. I'm still not clear what the Taoiseach is going to do about it, but the West Bank orphanage that were excluded from this and from the mother and baby redress scheme for those 50 children who suffered abuse, who suffered neglect, who suffered beatings, who were injected with things, and so on. Why are they being excluded? Are we going to give them what they asked for and include them in a proper scheme of redress and the supports that they need to make some atonement for what the institutions of church and state did to these children? So I hope the Minister is listening and will listen to the voices of the survivors. They're the ones that matter.